Thank you so much for inviting me to speak. I am really honored to be invited. And thanks also for arranging for a talk that suits both US and Singapore time. So I was asked today to give a kind of introduction and state of the field and to talk about approaches to manga studies. And I know that we have a very mixed audience listening today. And so I'm trying to address everybody as much as possible, undergraduates who are wanting to research manga. Also, I hope that my talk will be relevant to scholars in comic studies and in Japanese studies. And this is an example, my talk is an example of how to study manga in an academic way. So there are lots of different approaches that you can take to the academic study of manga. You can take an anthropological approach, fan studies, or looking at the working relationships between producers and artists. You could take an economic study or look at the business of publishing and merchandising. Those are all great approaches, but that's not the way that I do my research. My background is in literary studies, film studies, and art history. And so that's the approach that I take. And so my focus is on formal analysis, meaning how form makes meaning and how text and image work together to create a narrative. And so that's how I'll be approaching my topic today. And all of the content of my talk is part of a book manuscript that I'm working on manga in the 1950s and 60s and how manga genres and visual style developed in comparison with comics in the US and the UK. And so my big topics today will be on first-person narration in manga and comics, on action scenes and how manga splits up action scenes, and then on 4-panel comic strips, and a little bit at the end on online comics and Webtoon. And I'll be looking at manga with comparisons to US comics and international online comics. So I'm not only talking about manga today. And so I'm also hoping to give kind of a state of the field of manga studies and comic studies, although I don't intend this as a full overview. And so I'm not going to talk about every single important text. This is just a very quick look at a few major issues in comic studies as they intersect with manga studies. Okay, so in comics and language, Hannah Miedrag rightly points out that English language writing on comics has been distorted by defensiveness in an attempt to legitimize academic study of a medium that has for so long been demonized and marginalized in the US and the UK. This defensiveness is exacerbated by the very loud critical fandoms of some comics franchises, as well as antagonism between practitioners and academics. Miedrag quotes US comics studies scholar Joseph Wittek, who writes, quote, "This results in an argument delivered from a defensive crouch, a discourse addressed not to an audience of informed and sympathetic colleagues, but to an imperfectly imagined hangman's jury of deans, intra and extra disciplinary experts, the editors and readers of the Comics Journal, and the people who write book reviews on Amazon.com. All of these divergent discursive expectations and often contradictory intellectual goals." Similarly, Fart Beatty, writing in a special issue of Cinema Journal on comic studies in 2011, complains that, quote, "Comic studies lags about a half-century behind the academic study of film." And he continues, quote, "One of the turning points in the legitimization of film studies as a discipline was its ability to develop models of spectatorship that were unique to cinema, but also offered useful insights for the study of other art forms. The contributions of scholars like Laura Mulvey and Christian Metz are still taught even outside the confines of film studies. Comic studies, by contrast, has had no such breakthrough, and in fact relies largely on terms borrowed from film studies. Thus, comic studies remains peripheral to a broader rubric of media arts. For comic studies to reach parity with film studies, it would have to move beyond the narrowly thematic readings of key works and begin to offer critical insights into comics as a social and aesthetic system that has broader transmedia and intermedia implications." And Beatty suggests study of form and narrative as two possible ways to do this. And so this is the approach that I take in my work. I think also there are some additional reasons why the state of formal analysis in comics hasn't progressed equal to film. Now, first, film has the conventions of continuity editing, which is a coherent, fixed, and limited system of visual signifiers that are used in most narrative film and television worldwide, whereas comics and manga can be literally anything, like in this comic strip. And also, I don't have a visual example of this, but systems of signification can vary widely among comics, manga, between countries or between genres. And I'm sure you can think of examples of this. Comics and manga that are most embraced as literary or artistic also are often the most experimental or idiosyncratic. And many critical works on formal analysis of comics are limited by too narrow a focus. For instance, by neglecting manga or holding manga apart as an exotic other. Another major issue that Hannah Miodrag points to is a distrust in the West of images, especially a deep-seated anxiety about mixing text and image. And without getting into reductive East-West claims about the status of visual images, we can still see that in the US, historically, the combination of images and text was seen as a threat to the primacy of the written word. And for a long time, reading comics was claimed to be a mark of illiteracy. One sign of defensiveness in comic studies is to resist labeling comics as mere illustration or as a hybrid form, even though many comics and manga genres developed from illustration. And this resistance to hybridity also extends to anxiety around using hybrid theoretical tools, such as a combination of film studies, literary studies, and art history to discuss comics. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that, and that is the approach that I take. So these anxieties, either expressed or subconscious, are detrimental to comic studies. As Nick Sousanis asserts in Unflattening, comics has a dual nature, both simultaneous and sequential, both image and text. As Sousanis explains, duality or hybridity is the essential nature of comics and manga, and we should embrace it and use all the theoretical tools at our disposal. Now, manga studies doesn't really have this same issue with the divide between text and image, although it does have a similar issue with a loud, demanding fandom. I'm not really going to get into detail on that. So here we see two foremost examples of formal analysis in manga studies. Tezuka is Dead by Itogo and Why Manga is Interesting by Natsume Fusanosuke. So Itogo, among other topics, talks about what he calls the indeterminacy of the frame in manga and the tendency to open up or play with the frame. That's the box around the image. And I'll give examples of that later. Natsume Fusanosuke, one of his main points is on rhythms of compression and release in manga pacing. For example, hopefully this is not covered up. You can see here, yeah, thank you, that the small panels compress the action and increase the tension, followed by release of a larger panel showing the completed action. However, some issues I see in manga studies, oops, oh no, is that there is a gap between English language and Japanese language scholarship, in part because key texts are not translated. So for this reason, I intentionally analyze manga and comics in parallel, and today my examples of formal analysis will not only be limited to manga. Another problem I see is that shōjo manga, which is romance comics for teenage girls, are treated as a special case. And manga in comics, in manga studies in Japanese, really means shonen or seinen manga, which is action comics for boys and men, and is treated as an unmarked case. So one reason I focus on the historical development of visual narrative is to demonstrate that shōjo manga has always been central to manga expression. And I also look at Japanese manga and US comics in comparison, as this can highlight the artistic choices and the expressive capacity of the medium. Okay, so moving on to think more specifically about visual narrative in comics, then let's look at Wally Wood's 22 panels that always work. Wally Wood was a prolific and influential comics artist in the US in the 1950s and 60s, and among other places, he worked at Marvel, EC, and Mad Magazine. So this slide is a list of ways to create visual interest in panels without action. This list was circulated informally among comics artists in the 1960s. However, each of these panels is informed by the conventions of film, so much so that fans made an amateur video transposing each panel seamlessly to film. So this is the conventions of live action film. But here we see a fan parody, which shows a more comics-oriented approach, not just in the inherent silliness, but also in showing how in comics anything is possible, like occupying the same physical space as a tree, or try drawing a background. Obviously, most of these are not meant seriously, but it highlights some of the ways in which comics can be very different from film. And this is what Susanus calls the affordances of comics, that is, what the medium is capable of. So here we see another playful exploration of comics form and expression by Art Spiegelman, the creator of Mouse. He's reflecting here on the difference between text boxes and speech balloons. Speech balloons are the comics equivalent of dialogue or direct quotation, while text boxes are somewhat similar to authoritative, detached, omniscient narration in literature or voiceover narration in film. But there's a third option Spiegelman doesn't present here, and that is text outside word balloons or text boxes. And this is a technique that developed in shoujo manga, among other places, to express the interiority of the main characters. In manga theory, which is another major work in manga studies, Yomota Inuhiko says that text outside word balloons is equivalent to first-person narration. The emphasis on the inner life of the main character is appropriate to the genre of shoujo manga, which is all about depicting emotion. But the question of first and third person narration in a visual medium is rather more complex, as I will explain. The development of a clear, controlled narrative voice in either first or third person was key to the development of the modern novel. But these effects for representing the interiority of characters are harder to achieve in visual media, which tend toward externality. We see the characters in a live action film or animation as we do interlocutors in real life. While we may identify with them, it's more difficult to inhabit their thoughts the way that we can in a first-person novel. Devices to replicate first-person narration in film, like point-of-view shots and voiceover, are unpopular, and audiences tend to find these techniques intrusive and unconvincing. Comics and manga in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s also tend towards externality and third-person omniscient narration, and this is especially true of US newspaper comic strips, like Prince Valiant. And here, Hal Foster's style derives from late 19th century illustration, such as that by Howard Pyle, Arthur Rackham, Maxfield Parrish, and N.C. Wyeth. Foster never used speech balloons, which he believed cluttered and obscured the art. Although the text here isn't contained in boxes, there's a clear third-person omniscient narrative voice, and all of the dialogue is in quote marks, as in a novel. Another feature of this style is that the text describes the image. So there's a dual layer of signification. And this is another similar example in Flash Gordon by Alex Raymond. And Hal Foster and Alex Raymond were huge influence on artists who created superhero comics for Marvel and DC in the 1950s and 60s, including Jack Kirby and Wally Wood, who used their dynamic action layouts. And so from this, we can see US comics' tendency to portray action as a tableau. And this is in contrast to manga's in-the-moment style, which we'll look at in a minute. But shoujo manga actually also developed from illustration, specifically the style of illustration called jojoga, or lyrical pictures, that accompanied serialized novels in girls' magazines of the 1920s and 1930s. And this is what I wrote about in my book, Passionate Friendships. I'm not going to go into more detail on that here. But we can see that influence in this example from Maki's Whistle by Maki Miyako in 1960. So in this story, there's a lot of free-floating text, but the narrative voice is variable. Sometimes it's the main character Maki's thoughts, Sometimes it's the remembered dialogue of another character, and sometimes, as we see here, it's third-person narration, as in a picture book, explaining what's going on here in this frame below. And also, the art is expressive rather than representational. First-person narration outside of word balloons developed in shoujo manga in the 1960s. And here is one example, Flower Petal Diary by Nishitani Yoshiko from 1968. This story has a clearly articulated first-person narrative voice, which is appropriate for a story told in the format of a teenage girl's diary. And here we see her thoughts illustrated expressively with images of the characters that she is thinking about, especially in this panel. And now here's another example from a classic shoujo manga of the 1970s about ballet. And the important thing to note here is that the art is decorative and expressive, even abstract, in the repeated images of the main character, with her thoughts scattered about the page in free-floating text that's integrated into the art. We can also see on this page what Itogo calls the indeterminacy of the frame, as the frame itself becomes another design element, adding to the emotional impact. And so the page in shoujo manga is read as a whole, rather than being segmented into separate frames. This is another example from The Heart of Thomas by Hagiomoto. This is another major classic of shoujo manga. There are two main characters in this story, Eric and Yuri, and each of them gets extensive inner monologues in free-floating text. Rather than blocks of text, the words are integrated into the artwork, which is highly expressive, visually representing the mental state of the character whose thoughts we're reading. And this style has become firmly entrenched in the genre, as in this example from Hot Road by Tsumugi Taku. First-person narration drifts across the page, layered over and around the art with generous use of empty space, representing the teenage girl protagonist's subjectivity. And also here, the text alternates between vertical and horizontal, which further integrates the text into the artwork. Now, first-person narration outside text boxes appears across genres in manga today. And you can also see a lot of examples of it in American comics as well, even in Marvel superhero titles like Daredevil, at least recently. The opening 2 pages of this issue featured first-person narration scattered across the art, although it's always contained in text boxes. And the entire issue is written this way. But of course, Daredevil, like other Marvel titles, wasn't always like this. It didn't always have this first-person narration. In the 1960s, when the series began, the narration was strictly third person. So this switch to first person, like we see here, happened in the 1980s when Frank Miller took over as writer and magnified the film noir aspect of the series. Voiceover narration in the first person is a generic feature of film noir. But even so, putting the first-person narration in text boxes isn't always the most obvious stylistic choice, as we see in this film noir parody by Art Spiegelman. And here, the narration appears in thought balloons, which increase the distancing and closer to third-person narration, reporting the character's thoughts. By contrast, even the text boxes in Daredevil seem more direct. But it's worth reflecting a little bit more on the state of narration in Marvel Comics in the 1960s and what's called the Silver Age of American comics, when superheroes and particularly Marvel's distinctive style came to utterly dominate and define the medium of comics in the United States. As we see in this example, the text box is in the third person and describes and explains the action depicted in the art. Not only that, but the characters themselves tend to explain the action in thought and speech balloons. And in this bottom panel here, there are multiple levels of signification working overtime to deliver the same information as the art: the text box, the word balloons, and the sound effects. As we saw earlier with Prince Valiant, this is a feature of American comics with its roots in illustration. But here it seems almost ridiculously overdetermined. And one reason for this is what was called the Marvel method of writing, where Stan Lee would give a rough outline of a story to an artist who was responsible for filling in all the details, creating the layouts, and handing the finished art back to Stan Lee, who would then fill in the empty boxes and balloons. So as Lee was seeing the completed story for the first time as he was filling in the text, it's not surprising that he comments on the action like a bystander. This dual layer of signification between the text and art also points to the gap between the writer and the artist, as though Lee doesn't trust the artist to effectively tell the story. Stan Lee had a famously exploitative and antagonistic relationship with many of the artists working for him, particularly Jack Kirby. And it's also worth noting that the amount of writing that Lee actually did seems to have varied significantly. Wally Wood claims that Lee expected him to do all the writing himself, and indeed, the issues of Daredevil with Wood credited as artist have a lot fewer text boxes and commentary on the action. But it's not just this dual signification. Narration in Silver Age Marvel Comics is marked by a chatty tone, direct address to the reader, and shameless hucksterism. For example, here, Stan Lee, or whoever was writing this, directly addresses the Marvel fan and congratulates him for reading. In this example, he apologizes for wasting time on character development and promises to get back to the action. And in this example, the text box draws our attention to formal aspects of the lettering. I mean, from a narratological perspective, this is a really bizarre approach to storytelling. Neither novels nor film generally function this way. But this chatty insider tone cemented the emotional relationship between Marvel and its readers, who were mostly teenage boys. And this was a major part of Stan Lee's brand strategy for Marvel, and it was hugely successful. Now, as I said, it's not so uncommon to see first-person narration today, even in Marvel comics, as in this example from Ms. Marvel, but even the first-person narration tends to stay in these yellow boxes rather than being integrated into the art. To see examples of first-person narration outside of text boxes in US comics, we have to go far from Marvel to independent individualistic creators. So this is an example from the science fiction and fantasy series Saga by Brian Vaughan and Fiona Staples. And as you can see in the bottom panel here, the text is integrated into the artwork in a dramatic way. But here, the narration belongs to a character named Hazel, although she is only one of many focal characters, and she is clearly narrating in retrospect from a distance of many years and commenting on things she couldn't have known at the time, such as how her parents met. So even though this is first-person narration outside of word balloons, there's something very different from this first-person narration compared to shoujo manga. Now, literary theory and narratology can help us to understand these differences. Not all first-person narration is the same. This style that we see here, developed in classic shoujo manga of the 1970s, is very similar to the psychological novel, which features stream of consciousness narration presenting the thoughts of the character in the moment he experiences them. This kind of narration is what Gerard Genette calls intradiegetic, meaning within the plot, while Hazel's narration in Saga is extradiegetic, taking place outside of the time of the plot. Hazel also frequently engages in prolepsis, or forecasting future events, and the narrative moves unambiguously forward, typical of an action-based genre. The Heart of Thomas, on the other hand, is all about analepsis, or flashbacks, as Yuri attempts to understand and reconcile the past trauma of sexual abuse. To be more specific then, the free-floating text of shoujo manga is not just first person, but stream of consciousness, which is appropriate to the psychological stories that it narrates. Now, our discussion of first-person narration in Western comics wouldn't be complete without also considering autobiographical comics, which is a genre that has come to dominate indie comics in the US. Autobiographical comics are highly experimental and heterogeneous, I'm not going to account for everything or make big generalizations, but just take a quick look at a few prominent and influential examples. First, the granddaddy of autobiographical comics, American Splendor. Here, Harvey Pekar appears like the subject of a documentary film or an interview subject, not a first-person narrator. This external style reflects the way the comic was created, with Pekar writing a script and very basic layouts and sending it to Robert Crumb and other artists to illustrate. There's also an intentional defamiliarization here as Pekar engages in existential speculation. Another example is American Elf, which was a daily diary in a 4-panel strip by James Kochalka. And here he again presents himself externally with his thoughts in word balloons. In Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, she keeps her narration separate from the art. And the narration here also is extra diegetic. It's not stream of consciousness or in the moment. And the same is true of Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This is originally published in French. Even though the art is highly expressionistic, the text is fully separated from the art, and the narration recounts things that happened in the past rather than stream of consciousness. However, there are examples of narration outside of text boxes in Western comics. This is My Favorite Thing is Monsters by Emil Ferris. This comic is in the form of the diary of a teenage girl to the extent of being drawn on actual spiral-bound notebooks. Like shoujo manga, it's narrated intradiegetically in a stream of consciousness style. And the narrator depicts herself as a monster. This is her in the center here. So the artwork is expressionistic rather than mimetic. And this was Ferris's first comic after a career as an illustrator, which may also be a reason why she uses this style. Now, this example here is from Blankets, which I think is the closest to shoujo manga. And it's the coming of age story of a sensitive, introspective teenage boy. And as we see here, the intradiegetic or stream of consciousness narration is fully integrated into the art as an aesthetic element rather than separated from it. So returning to Spiegelman then, while there's an immediacy in speech balloons, there's even more immediacy in text integrated into the art. So next, I'll discuss how manga depicts action scenes and what I've referred to as manga's in-the-moment style. Film and manga featuring sword fighting have an underlying formal problem in fight scenes, which is that the action is over very quickly, sometimes even faster than the eye can see. So how can film make a duel that is fast and brief more visually interesting? They use a lot of strategies like large crowds observing the duel, atmospheric use of scenery, exaggerated blood spurts, and manga use all of these techniques as well. But the formal question for manga isn't really how to prolong the action, as this is much more easily done in a drawn medium through compression and release, as Natsume Fusanosuke explains. The question for all action scenes in manga is how to segment the action into panels, where to begin and end the movement, and whether to draw the beginning, middle, or end of a movement, and how to depict violent, fast movement in a static two-dimensional medium. And in addition to this pace of compression and release, one major way that you can see in this page here is through the use of speed lines, which manga uses extensively. And as Ryan Holmberg writes, quote, while manga's distinctive speed lines ultimately descend from the visual wakes and impact lines of classical American and European cartooning, they were shaped into their present form by manga's binary system of anticipating, sensing eyes, and vectorial graphic storms. But ineffective use of speed lines only draws the reader's attention to the lack of believable movement. So we might think of these two extremes of drawing action as tableau versus in the moment. In tableau or dramatic stillness, with the characters posed in a visually arresting but static scene, often at the end of a moment of action. In the moment style shows the action as it's taking place with extreme use of speed lines and many small panels to show the action as it happens. Many manga artists use this. This example is from Shirato Sanpei. And they tend to show the action in the beginning of the sword swing and the after effects, but elide the moment that the sword strikes. And this comes from film where the sword connecting with the target isn't always shown for practical effects reasons. In this example here, Jutaro demonstrates his skill with the sword by slashing at trees. And there are lots of panels showing the middle of the movements as he swings his sword, but we don't see the moment that his sword connects with the tree. Only the after effects. The tree falls over as he walks away, with the reactions of the observers emphasizing his skill. And as Ryan Holmberg notes, these storms of speed lines are often conflated with diegetic storms. So Jutaro, who's the main character, is shown against panels filled with speed lines representing both wind and the movement of his sword. The storms externalize his inner torment, and the many close-ups on his eyes draw the reader into his subjectivity. And this is very different from the limited use of speed lines and tableau arrangement of Jack Kirby, for example. Now, Speed lines are one example of visual expression or idiom that's specific to comics. It doesn't really occur in other visual media like film. So looking at these things like speed lines and where it comes from and how we can talk about them brings us to some crucial issues in manga studies. And this is also my bridge to my next topic, which is on the 4-panel comic strip. So another major problem in manga studies, I think, is the tendency towards overt nationalist mythmaking. With some scholars, some academic scholars, but mainly in the public or the popular discourse in both Japanese and English language. And the myth that we see here is that the origins of manga lie in classical Japanese art. And this myth is particularly persistent. In fact, in the year 2000, the Ministry of Education in Japan required the national junior high school curriculum to include teaching of manga as, quote, one of Japan's traditional modes of expression, with the causal link between Shojugiga, this scroll from the 12th century, Hokusai manga from the Edo period, and contemporary manga made explicit. This link not only rescues manga from its previously low status within Japan, but also capitalizes on manga's international popularity to boast of Japanese uniqueness. But this is not true. This is not where manga comes from at all. The actual origin of manga is in Meiji and Taisho era newspaper cartoons, as Ike Echner explains in this book. By looking at these cartoons or comic strips, we can see the development of manga as a modern hybrid medium, as well as the influence of American comics and the centrality of the comic strip. Sequential narrative, or dividing a story into multiple images, usually divided by frames, is one of the central features of modern comics. The other is the combination of text and image to create what Ike Echner calls the audiovisual stage. He defines this as a comic in which sound and image are synchronous. The reader must have the impression of watching and hearing at the same time the action portrayed in the comic strip. This is seen most clearly in the speech balloon and sound effects, which are examples of intradiegetic sound, meaning that it's audible to the fictional characters, even though the words themselves are extradiegetic, meaning the characters don't see them. And the effect of reading them is what Echner calls transdiegetic. He writes, quote, "The comic strip form of graphic narrative, the audiovisual stage on paper, can only be understood via the tripartite division of content into intra, extra, and transdiegetic. This is because the conceptual division of visual content into these three distinct categories, while simultaneously combining the three in the same image space, is precisely what distinguishes the comic strip from earlier forms of graphic narrative." Now, speed lines also are an example of transdiegetic content. And some other examples are what's called emanata in English, or manpu in Japanese, that is visual representations of emotional states like pain stars, which we see here, or sweat drops and other things like that. The division of narrative into frames and the audiovisual stage developed in Europe and the United States in the 19th century, as Echner explains in his book, at the same time as the technologies of recording sounds and images. And Jared Gardner, who I think many of you know and may be listening to this talk, he writes that the comic strip, quote, "is a form of storytelling that simply did not exist before the 20th century and could not have existed without the daily audiences and publication schedule of the newspaper." And Echner explains that this style came to Japan in 1923 with the publication of the American comic strip Bringing Up Father by George McManus, which was translated as Oyaji Kyoiku and Asahi Graph. And the massive popularity of Oyaji Kyoiku in the 1920s encouraged other newspapers to carry more American comic strips, with most of the successful strips of this era being translated into Japanese. Many Japanese artists, including Tezuka, learned to draw by copying American comic strips and comic books, either licensed or unlicensed. And Tezuka's work contains many references to American comic strips and comic books of the 1920s and 30s. He specifically mentions being influenced by Bringing Up Father. His other major influence was pirated Disney comic books, which were circulating widely in Japan in the 1930s, as Otsuka Eiji explains in his book. So Jumping from Chojugiga to Hokusai manga to Tezuka posits a specifically Japanese lineage, conveniently ignoring foreign influences. And the insular nature of the manga industry in the 1960s and 70s gives a false impression that manga developed independently of Western cartooning, but this is not true. This here is the actual lineage of manga from American newspaper strips and comic books. Now, in the history of the form, comic strips came before comic books or story manga and include many of the features that now define the medium, including long-form serialization, a wide variety of genres aimed at both male and female readers, aimed at adults, not only children, and use of what Exner calls the audiovisual stage. Now, among other innovations, Tezuka is often falsely credited with popularizing story manga, that means long-form narrative storytelling, as opposed to the 4-panel comic strip, or what's called Yonkoma in Japanese. While there are many popular and influential comic strips in Japan, Yonkoma or 4-panel strips is usually left out of studies of manga history and manga formal analysis, and dismissed as a lesser form that Tezuka overcame by introducing story manga or long-form narrative. But Yonkoma strips are central to the formal development of manga. In manga studies, there's been very little examination of the 4-panel strip. Despite its centrality in manga history and the fact that there are many popular influential strips in Japanese newspapers, including Sadae-san, and also the fact that 4-panel strips in other genres, more recent genres, like slice of life, for example, Lucky Star, still comic strips are not usually mentioned in manga studies. But comic studies in the US, on the other hand, there's been a lot of writing on comic strips. For example, Jared Gardner's book is one example of that. Another recent example of writing on comic strips in English is this book, How to Read Nancy, which delves deeply into formal analysis of a single 4-panel or 3-panel strip. However, as interesting and detailed as this analysis is, they never consider the format of the 4-panel strip as a whole. There's something very specific about the 4-panel strip as a self-replicating form. American cartoonist Phil Griffith breaks the conventions of the form down to its basic parts here: intro, setup, conflict, and punchline. And this 4-part structure was also commented on way back in 1927 in Japan in an essay in Asahi Graph by the cartoonist Okamoto Ippei. And he discusses 4-panel or Yonkoma strips in terms of classical Chinese poetry, with the form Kisho Tenketsu, which means introduction, development, turning point, and conclusion. And this 4-part structure is still widely used in East Asia across many media. But looking at comics in this way, or manga in this way, I think is another example of high culture claims about the origins of manga. It's rooted in both nationalism and status seeking. But nevertheless, Kisho Tenketsu is still widely cited today. If you go looking on the internet, you will come across this example with Nakashima Taiyo graphing the progression of a comic strip like this. Although actually, I think maybe a better representation of the pacing of comic strips might be the Jo-Ha-Kyu structure of no plays, because it has an increasing rhythm and ending immediately at the climax or punchline. We also have to acknowledge that the 4-panel comic strip developed in the West and then was in Europe and the United States, and then was imported to Japan and elsewhere. And also the 3-act structure is universal to a lot of cultures, including like Hollywood films all have this 3-act structure. So, this isn't something that is specifically Japanese. And I don't think that Kisho Tenketsu is a useful way to think about comic strips, but there is something about the 3 or 4-panel structure that is very powerful. The 4-panel comic strip form is so enduring, flexible, and instantly recognizable that you can replace the text with gibberish, as American artist Jaime Hernandez does here. Although the characters and the language here are wholly invented for this strip alone, the gag is still legible. Likewise, the punchline at the end can be inferred even if the artist doesn't give you one specifically. Here, the last panel is just a blank. We can also see the same form at work in Lucky Star, where the gag is understated, which is typical of this series. But the combination of the Yonkoma 4-panel format and the characters based on well-known genre conventions create emotional engagement for the fans. And this format was reproduced even in the anime version, where they didn't have to stick just to this format, but they chose to do so anyway. Now, my final example of formal analysis of the 4-panel strip is the loss meme, which I think some of you may know. But before we look at that, we first need to know what memes are and how they circulate. So I find memes to be a really interesting combination of text and image. Technically, of course, the combination of text and image itself is called an image macro. And the meme refers to the way these image macros are shared and altered across the internet. The power of the most successful memes is not only a clever gag juxtaposed with juxtaposing text and image, but also the knowledge of how a particular meme template has circulated. As in this example here, the same images tend to get reused over and over. And part of the pleasure of reading and sharing these memes is recognizing the references, remixes, and patterns of reuse. Memes are like in-jokes that anyone can access, or at least anyone who spends enough time on the internet. And while today memes are low culture, I find this is actually not so different from a poetic allusion and visual references that we see in art in Japan and other places also in previous eras. Now, the loss meme is an example of the expressive power of the 4-panel strip in its most elemental form. The original 4-panel strip, which we see here, comes from the webcomic Control-Alt-Delete by Tim Buckley, which mostly featured silly gags about video gamers. But in June 2008, all of a sudden, Buckley published this strip titled Loss, which depicted the main character's girlfriend suffering a miscarriage. And readers reacted very negatively to this jarring change in tone from jokey to suddenly maudlin, and they saw this as a failed attempt at seriousness. The Lost strip was widely parodied, and these endless parodies evolved first from redrawing the strip to later simply echoing the positions of the main subjects within each frame. The Lost meme at its most minimalist is a distillation of the 4-panel strip that leverages the form of the strip with the pleasure of remixing and in-jokes. This breakdown of the 4-panel strip shows that the form itself can create meaning even when most of the content is taken away. While the comic strip is often overlooked, perhaps because its format is so rigid, we can see here that the 4-panel form is endlessly generative and a distillation of genre expectations to create tension and surprise. Now, finally, my discussion of form and meaning in comics wouldn't be complete without looking at how the change in medium from paper to online comics is driving changes in art styles. Webtoon, we see the landing page here, is currently the largest online comics platform originating in South Korea. Webtoon was started in 2004 by Naver Corporation, but it grew exponentially when it launched as an app in 2014 and went international with versions in multiple languages. Webtoon has pushed rapidly into multiple markets, including the United States, hosting both professionally edited and self-published titles in every genre, with rapid translation of top titles across 7 languages. Webtoon also encourages and hosts fan translations into even more languages. It hosts a wide variety of self-published titles in art styles that are a mashup not only of Japanese manga and Korean manhwa, but also British, American, and European comic styles. The most prominent change in online comics form is the switch to vertical scrolling in the panel arrangement, as comics are optimized to be read on a mobile phone. And it's really hard to get a sense of what it looks like on a phone on this PowerPoint slide. I've had to cut up the frames, but you can imagine. This example is from the series Unholy Blood, which was published in Korean by Lina Im. And you can see here that each panel is not only vertical, but very long, sometimes without clear breaks between the panels. And you can see the movement from top to bottom rather than right to left or left to right as you would on a printed page. Also, the digital medium allows for blurred effects to indicate movement in action scenes, as we see here. And overall, the portrayal of action seems maybe a bit closer to animation in contrast to the influence of live action film that I discussed earlier. Webtoon also sometimes introduces minimal sound and animation, and as in this example from the romance comic, the romance title Flawless, and this was originally published in Indonesian. So here, actually, this doesn't have sound effects or music in the background or GIF or flash animation, but even so, the vertical line backgrounds and panel arrangement create a sense of movement or even appear slightly animated as the reader scrolls. And as in shoujo manga, these emotive backgrounds represent the inner thoughts of the character, and there is extensive use of text integrated into the art. Now, finally, this is an example from a very minor title called Ritanjoy's Tragicomedy by a university student in the Philippines, I think. It doesn't have very many readers and it is self-published, but it is a striking example of formal experimentation. And also we see in the middle panel here some alternating between vertical and horizontal arrangement, which occurs very frequently in online comics across all genres and styles. But we can also see what Itogo calls the indeterminacy of the frame, where the frame itself merges with the subjects. So it might seem strange for me to end my talk by looking at a very obscure self-published comic by an amateur artist. But it's important to remember that when the manga industry in its current form first developed in the 1950s, it was likewise amateurish, obscure, and created by teenagers. Informally, I've heard a number of comics and manga scholars criticize online comics, and particularly Webtoon, for being amateurish, derivative, and uninteresting. But manga in the 1950s and 60s developed as it did because no one was paying attention to it or taking it seriously as an art form. As long as titles sold, editors took a sort of anything goes approach. But today, manga has become big business, and there's much less room for experimentation. It's really in Webtoon and similar online platforms that new forms of comics and manga are emerging, which are hybrids of technology, of still and moving images, and also hybrids of genres and national styles. And I look forward to seeing how these things continue to develop. All right, so that's it for my talk today. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.